Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com, and today I'm talking about how to find and capture ideas for your novel. So one of the most common questions that writers get asked is, where do you get your ideas from? Now it's funny now because I've written quite a lot of novels, but I still remember back when I used to work in the cubicle farm in my old day job, and I never thought I would ever be able to write a novel. I didn't think I was creative. I mean, I wasn't creative. I was implementing accounts payable, and I just had no ideas at all. So I actually had to retrain my brain in order to start finding ideas and putting them together into stories. So how can you start to find ideas? Number one, trust your curiosity. And in fact, even more than that, you have to learn to identify your curiosity. And this is really about what you're interested in. So if you go to a new place or you walk into a bookstore, where do you go first? If you walk into a museum, which section do you want to go to? If you go to a park, which people do you find interesting? What are the things that catch your eye? Now, as authors, we're also readers. So what are the genres that you read? What are the covers that capture your attention? And this sort of tuning in to what you're curious about is the beginnings of ideas. So I get a lot of ideas from different books and websites. This is one of the books I really like, Atlas Obscura, and this idea of different places with interesting objects and things, that's where I get a lot of my ideas from my Arcane series. Because of course, every day we're surrounded by millions of sensory details and stimuli and people and things, and we could get completely overwhelmed, but our brains hone in to the things that we're actually curious about. So start identifying those, and if you're having a problem identifying them, start thinking back to when you were at a time in your life when you did notice. So what did you enjoy when you were a child? What did you like looking at? Or like, I remember I always wanted to be an archaeologist, and when I was sort of 12, 13, I used to get a lot of ancient Egyptian books and colouring books, and that sort of obsession with Egypt has carried through into my novels. And of course, ideas are a bit like a muscle. So if you walk into a gym right now and try to pick up like 50 kilos or something, you won't be able to do that because you haven't developed the muscle. But if you start small and you start working up to it, then that is something that might be possible for you. And in the same way, when you start listening, when you start tuning in to what you're curious about, in that way, you will start to get more and more ideas, because what inevitably happens, or what's happened to me, is you go from someone who doesn't have any ideas to someone who has so many ideas you don't know which one to write next. Number two, consume in order to produce. Now, one of the most common reasons for writer's block is that you're trying to create from an empty mind. And in fact, I like The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, who talks about going on an artist's date, because you need to put stuff into your head so that you can then let ideas percolate, and then you'll be able to write from what is inside your head. But if you are not adding new things into your brain, it's going to be very hard to produce words on the page. So the idea of the artist's date is to make time, actually put a time in your diary as if you were having a date with somebody else, and go and fill your creative well. So that might be an art gallery, it might be a walk in nature, it might be a trip. I do quite a lot of travel. It might be traveling on YouTube or traveling on Google Earth or something like that. It might be reading, it might be anything that actually adds new material into your brain. You also need to consider getting outside your comfort zone, because that's where you're going to experience things that will give you ideas beyond your normal life. So for example, with my book Desecration, the idea for this book, and in fact the opening scene, is set in the Hunterian Museum in London, which is basically a medical specimen museum. And I walked in there and I had a real visceral reaction to seeing the human body parts in these jars. And my first thought, because let's face it, writers are weird, is what if there was a murder in the middle of this museum? So there's a dead body surrounded by these body parts, and how would that, why would that happen in a sort of anatomy museum? So, and that memory, that sort of visceral reaction to a physical place, is what starts many of my books. Another idea is to use a McGuffin, which in mysteries and thrillers is a thing that the characters seek. So a really kind of common one in the religious thrillers that I enjoy is the Ark of the Covenant, and in fact I've used that in Ark of Blood, one of my arcane thrillers. And basically, obviously I haven't seen the Ark of the Covenant, nobody has, but it's one of these fabled objects that people seek, and you can use an object like, well, any kind of object in terms of a MacGuffin, and weave your own original story around something that other authors have used. Another consideration is what fascinates you about people, or are there particular characters that you see or people that you notice that are interesting, or even jobs that you think it might be cool to do. So again, in Desecration, I have a character who works at the British Museum as a researcher, and I've been to the British Museum a lot and I love it, and the idea of being a researcher somewhere where they would have access to all these cool objects made me want to write a character who was there and imagine what would happen behind the scenes. So if you meet people who are interesting, or you see a film or TV, or you read a book about people who are interesting, then write down some notes about that character. And of course you can, and we all do, use aspects of the real people in our lives in our books, but just make sure you're making a sort of amalgamation of those people and don't use a real person in exactly the same way in your fiction. Another way to spark ideas is to use real events. So this book, Risen Gods, which is a sort of dark fantasy thriller set in New Zealand. Now in 2011, there was a devastating tidal wave and earthquakes that really kind of destroyed the city of Christchurch in New Zealand. Now I lived in New Zealand for 7 years, and it's a country that's on the Pacific Rim of fire, and it has a lot of volcanic activity. So I imagined, what if you were out sailing on that bay as the tidal wave came in? And what if actually below the surface of New Zealand there were gods who wanted to take their land back, the Maori gods, for example? So this is a story that's based on a real happening, so the 2011 earthquake, but also a what if question about thinking outside of what actually happened or the reasons why it happened. So using real events in fiction, you can either, if you're writing a historical novel, of course, you can use them in a more normal way. But if you write fantasy like me or thriller, you can take that into the level of a different story. What if questions are also a really good basis for stories. So take something like The Stand by Stephen King, which is, what if 99% of the population is wiped out by a plague? And that book is nearly 40 years old now, and yet the post-apocalyptic genre continues to be more and more popular as people imagine, what if you are the one left after the destruction of humanity? Or on a more, upbeat note, what if a billionaire came and offered you a contract to be his live-in lover, which some people may recognise from 50 Shades of Grey? Or something like The Martian by Andy Weir, which started out as a self-published book, which is what if you were stranded on Mars? So these are some of the questions that could spark other ideas. Another way to spark ideas is through the use of quotes, and many authors will put quotes at the beginning of their novels as a sort of reminder of the things that spark the idea. So at the beginning of my thriller Destroyer of Worlds is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which was also quoted by Oppenheimer when the first atomic bomb went off, which is, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And so that quote I used as the basis for a story about an ancient artifact that is also a weapon that could destroy India and the world, because that's what you do with thrillers, you make it really big stakes. But that one quote encapsulated the idea of the whole book. Then, of course, you can use themes or societal issues that you care about. But of course, you don't want to be preachy. You want to use that in ways within your story that people almost don't realise you're talking about that. So this novel, it's a fantasy thriller, was written at a time when the politics of the world were a lot around borders and refugees, and when Brexit happened in Britain and the change in status around nationalism and basically around borders. And that became the backdrop of the book, and I began to get fascinated with maps and cartography and what happened when you draw a line on a map and who's on one side and who's on the other side. These are big issues, but I turned it into a fantasy adventure, and I care about that topic a lot, but if you read the book you might not even realise that that is a theme. Then, of course, you can use ideas from other books, because after all, we're all readers, and as Pulitzer Prize winning author Cormac McCarthy said, books are made out of books. And of course, there's a big difference between using your reading to spark ideas and plagiarism, which is directly copying things from other people. So we don't plagiarize, but we do look at other ideas and mash them together and create new things from them. So, for example, my short story collection, 1,000 Fiendish Angels, is based on Dante's Inferno. Now, of course, Inferno is out of copyright, it's very old now, and my short stories were actually commissioned for the launch of Dan Brown's book Inferno a few years back. And essentially I got Dante's book, I went through it, I wrote notes, I wrote down the language, how the sinners were kept down in hell, and then I incorporated that into my own stories. And there are 3 stories, a historical one, a modern day one, and a post-apocalyptic one, all linked together by a book of human skin because I write dark fiction. But of course the stories themselves are full of references to Dante, but it's not plagiarized from Dante. One word of caution: if you do take notes from other books, be careful not to copy things down word for word unless you're going to use it as a direct quote. You might just otherwise plagiarize on purpose. So what I tend to do is just take notes that are not a direct copy, so that there's just no way by accident I can plagiarize. But really good to take notes on books, and it's a huge part of my research process. And then finally, make sure you capture your ideas, because there are some people who think, oh, well, if it's a good enough idea, I'll remember it, but it's not true. When you start tuning in to the number of ideas you have every day, it's just huge. And if you don't write it down, you won't remember it, I promise you. So you can write it down in different ways. I have journals, and you can see how fat this one is. I write in them by hand, and I also type sometimes and print things out, because I can actually type a lot faster than I can write by hand. I use little ones, which I put in my handbag if I'm sort of out and don't have a bigger bag for the larger notebook. I also use my phone, and I use Things app on the iPhone, and that syncs with my Mac so that I can pick those notes up later. I also take a lot of photos. So when I do research trips, I put those pictures on Instagram at JFPennAuthor, and I also put them on Facebook and all the different places. I also have loads more in my photo album that I use to refer back to later to sort of refresh those ideas. Other people use apps like Evernote or Scrivener, and of course it doesn't really matter how you do it, but it is important to do it, because otherwise you'll just lose track of those ideas. And if you start writing them down, you actually realise how many you have, and that's cool. And then when you're writing a new book, you can go back over your list, you can find things that you thought were interesting and amalgamate them into a new story. Okay, so those are my thoughts on how to find and capture ideas for your novel. And if you'd like more help, you can get your 7 steps to write a novel cheat sheet at thecreativepenn.com/7 steps. So happy writing, and I'll see you next time.